And I will probably shut down the video just so that's to save up my bandwidth of the Wi-Fi, just in case.
Okay.
All right. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and start, Bilal, so that Dr. Ubbink and Dr. Levine,
Yes.
are you okay with that? Us going ahead and starting?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can go ahead and get started. And
Yeah, I'm
with
admitting
folks.
everyone. Oh, I see Bipin Shah is here.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're getting some folks in from the waiting room, but welcome to the Cal Poly Don B. Huntley College of Agriculture's plant-based lecture series. My name is Dr. Colleen Isom, and I'm an assistant professor in the Nutrition and Food Science Department. With me today, I have my colleagues, Dr. Bilal Hassan, Dr. Fatima Subhan, and Dr. Zhu Yang. They are all going to be helping us with the webinar today, and Dr. Bilal Hassan will introduce our speakers in just a moment, so that everybody knows where to go for questions. We will have time at the end of the presentation for questions. You can enter them into the chat section of the Zoom, and Dr. Subhan and the rest of us facilitators will be monitoring those questions for our speakers. Before we get started, I just want to let you know a little bit about how these series came to be. Our wonderful supporter, Mr. Bipin Shah, who's here actually, hello, hi, was able to allow us to put together these lecture series, and we try to hold them every semester, providing education about plant-based nutrition in some way or form, whether that be a food science focus or a nutrition focus or an environmental focus. There's so many different avenues of where you can focus your plant-based knowledge and efforts. So I would just want to give Mr. Shah a few minutes just to say a few words, if you'd like, about the importance of plant-based eating.
Okay, so good morning, everybody, those who are in California, and good afternoon to everybody else. So I guess we set this up with, we have a minor besides this lecture in plant-based food technology at Cal Poly. And setting up of this minor had three objectives in mind. One was health. It's proven now beyond a doubt, and all the medical science agrees that, you know, plant-based food is healthier than other foods. The second is environmental or sustainability, and you know, if you look at this whole global warming issue, the data says that about 20% of the environmental issues are caused by, you know, raising cattle for meat. Okay, so animal meat affects the environment in a way that many people may not realize. And the third, as a Jain, which is our religion, we also wanted to minimize, you know, or call it enhanced nonviolence. So those were the three objectives when we set up the program, and I'm happy to say that things are going well. And I compliment the head of the department, Dr. Singh, who is not here due to some surgery that he was involved in. but all his staff members, Bilal, Colleen, and everybody else is doing well. So that is all I would like to say, and not want to take thunder away from our speakers today. The only one thing I'd like to add is going through the web search for things in the plant-based food area. I found a website says the Good Food Initiative, GFI.com, and those who are interested may look into it further. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for your support in allowing us to have our plant-based minor as well as this wonderful plant-based lecture series. So folks, again, if you're just joining us, you can put your questions into the chat and we'll have time at the end of the session to answer those. But we have two wonderful speakers today that I'd like to have Dr. Hassan introduce. You're more than welcome to turn the video off on your camera if you'd like, or keep it on. But folks, if we do hear background noise, we will mute you. So please just make sure if you're an attendee that you're muted on the sound. All right, well, I will turn it over to Dr. Hassan for introductions.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Appreciate you, Dr. Sum. And I would like to introduce our wonderful speakers today. Thank you so much for joining us and contributing to our plant-based lecture series. I have Dr. Allen Levine as a past Vice President of Research at the University of Minnesota and Professor Dean Emeritus of Food Science and Nutrition. Prior to his service he served as a Vice Provost of the Faculty and Academic Affairs and the Dean of the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resources Science and the Head of Department of Food Science and Nutrition. He was the Associate Director of Research and the Senior Career Scientist at the Minneapolis VA Medical Center for 26 years. He also founded the NDDK-funded Minnesota Obesity Center and was the director for 20 years from 1995 to 2015. Welcoming you, Dr. Levine. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have also his colleague and the current head of department, Dr. Job Ubbink, is a professor and the department head of Department of Food Science and Nutrition at University of Minnesota. And he was trained as a physical and polymer chemist at the University of Leiden, the Netherlands. And he obtained his PhD in chemical engineering and material science from at Delft University of Technology, the Netherlands. He has worked for over 15 years in R&D positions in the food industry, including at Nestle. Prior to joining University of Minnesota, he was associated with California Polytechnic State University, not ours, San Luis Obispo, and the University of Preston in the UK, and the ETH Zurich in Switzerland. He was visiting scientist at Moscow State University in Russia, and he has taught as a visiting professor at the School of Food and Engineering, University of Campinas in Brazil. His research interests include the phase mapping and water management of texturization plant proteins and the glass state in food rheology and highly concentrated systems, the interface between food processing and society, and the science of cooking. And by the way, he is my mentor and my previous advisor. Thank you so much, Dr. Ubbink and Dr. Levine, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Dr. Hassan. And on behalf of Allen Levine, also our gratitude for inviting us to this distinguished lecture series named after Bipin and Rekha Shah. And we'll be very happy to add some elements to this broad conversation about plant-based foods. And the request was to turn it to that interface with processing. I think I'll start with sharing my screen. Can everyone see it? Great. So we'll be talking about our processed plant-based foods healthy for you. Now that's a very wide theme. Processing is a broad theme, as we'll find out, and what is healthy is also a very broad theme. So we try to really initiate a discussion at this interface. And Al and me started having deeper conversations about this, I think close to 2 years ago, year and a half ago, in the framework, and we'll introduce that, of ultra-processed foods. And that was a point of view where we think that ultra-processed foods as a concept, and we'll come to that in a few minutes, is really a key one, but there's also something lacking. And specifically, we felt that it interface with processing that we could perhaps add some additional dimensions. So I'd like to take you through that journey, but we actually approach it today from the side of plant-based foods. Let me see if I can go to my outline. So introduction, plant-based foods. Then what is food processing, specifically in the context of plant-based foods? We'll talk about the interface between processing and health-based implications. Specifically, Al will add a lot of detail there. Then we'll go to what we know, what we typically understand in the current or contemporary situation about, plant-based food and plant-based nutrition, very often high-protein foods. These tend to go to that ultra-processed side. So I'd like to bring up a conversation around that processing aspect, as well as the health implications of these novel categories of foods. Then we'll go to formulation and talk about food additives, if there's time enough. And really also, I'll like to add some context to that and some of the current research in the field up onto the health status and some consequences of some of these food additives. Let me first kick up on our diet. This is a very high-level overview of how our diet in the US, the standard diet, the majority diet, the average diet, whatever way you want to call it, in these food categories, where we see that these plant-based parts are very important. Fruits and vegetables, fairly minor, but of course they're low calorie. So typically it should be a significant part of our consumption. And then flour and cereal, there's a lot of it actually that we routinely eat in a number of ways in our diet, from marginally processed foods to very, very intensely processed ultra-formulated foods. Also, one thing which distinguishes specifically the United States, but it's actually growing worldwide, is the processed food consumption. This is a recent map, a recent chart with the calorie intake on the in blue of the food, the percentage of food consumption based on these ultra-processed foods, which are typically these foods which are highlighted here, like extruded cereals, breakfast cereals, frozen desserts, fast foods, etc., etc. And we see that in the United States, we're actually close to 60% of our caloric intake on average with these categories of food. What are ultra-processed foods? Now, I think Will, Al, and me have a dimension to add to that, but just to bring everyone up to the same speed. This was introduced, a scheme which was introduced by Brazilian researchers about 15 years ago, under leadership of Carlos Monteiro, professor at USP in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, looking at the dietary impact of foods, not so much as of their composition, in macronutrients and micronutrients, their caloric content, etc., but introducing the notion of degrees of processing. He introduced 4 different categories of processing: the so-called unprocessed, or maybe better said, minimally processed foods, and there's some definition there and some examples. Then what he calls processed culinary ingredients. Think here about things like flours or oils that you can use actually to create dishes. Then a third category, which is a very broad category of processed foods, which are typically foods that are prepared with simple transformations, but they can still have significant impact, of the category of foods from the first group. So that's all good and well. And then he proceeds further by introducing that category of ultra-processed foods that I just mentioned. And I've highlighted that here in yellow, that he defines as formulations of ingredients, mostly exclusive of industrial use, made of a series of industrial processes, many requiring sophisticated equipment and technology, hence ultra-processed. This encompasses these categories that I mentioned, like breakfast cereals, like snacks, like candy bars, frozen desserts, fast food, etc. This category, while it's a really important contribution, also knows a number of flaws. And that's where actually Al and me started to have that conversation from how does processing come into part. And we actually will introduce our perspective throughout this lecture. But we believe, just in a few words, that it's not only the processing, and very often maybe not mainly the processing, but rather the way that these foods are put together. So the way these foods are formulated, that makes them unhealthy or not fitting in significant amounts in a healthy, balanced type of diet. So now the processing of plant-based foods, because also that whole association of this category of ultra-processed foods with processing, that's something which I think leads to a lot of discussion and debate and controversy even into the field, because we say food processing essential to supply mankind with an abundant, safe, appealing, healthy, shelf-stable supply of foods. And that's true. So let's have a look initially at that processing. I want to go really back in the history of mankind. I must say, I already brought it up when I was teaching food technology in Zurich at the ETH, is actually there are hypotheses around with partial confirmation that actually the human being, the Homo sapiens, with its big brain and its very limited gastrointestinal tract, could only evolve by actually using basically fire to prepare foods in a state that we could actually easily digest and get the required nutrients out of it. So that's an hypothesis with some conversation already since about 20 years going on. There are books about it. I highlighted this article on did cooked tubers spur the evolution of big brains? And that could well be the case. So in certain setting, actually, the whole food processing could be maybe mankind's first engineering discipline. There are studies, and I just want to briefly highlight one that's actually, I think, a very interesting modeling study, and comparing that across the whole category of primates about the body mass index of these species, as well as the number of brain neurons. So that, let's say that the size or the complexity, may be better stated, of the brain. And then here in these various colors and these various lines, that actually are the eating times that these species, that individuals from these species would need to obtain enough food to satisfy the caloric needs of their bodies. What we see here in red, that is us, that are Homo sapiens, we're here on this call. It means that for that complexity of the requirement to actually be able to digest these foods, that we'll be eating at least 9 to 10 hours a day, which is thought to be not really feasible. The same is for the Neanderthals and the Heidelberg man and so on. So this is an indication, at least a partial additional confirmation, that something needed to be available to pre-process that food to actually allow a higher uptake of nutrients, of energy from the diets at that stage, hinting again into the use of fire in preparing foods. So what is processing? And I think this is a crucial element to bring into the conversation. I'm taking here one of the many definitions that are around, and this is a definition from the Institute of Food Technology. They should know about it. It's basically centered, and I won't read the whole definition, around transformation. So they transform agricultural products into food products. So key thing with actually the process is the process of transformation. So converting it from one form into another one. How does that impact our food supply? What do we hope to attain by the transformation? Short term, things that we really want to have there, things like no foodborne illnesses, shelf life, products should taste good, consistency of quality, fits with a lifestyle, should be available, accessible, should have shelf life, it should be also convenient. The other thing is, and that are all the things on the short term, and I think we check off all the boxes in the, with the food processing and for that we do. We also have long-term implications. It should be environmentally friendly. A lot of conversations, and Dr. Shah mentioned it, on the sustainability of our food supply. They should be nutrient dense, specifically for micronutrients. We want to have a rounded range of ingredients and nutrients to feed and nourish our bodies. We want to avoid chronic diet-related diseases, very, very important in our current society. And we want that our energy density is not too high, because we know we are, I saw some latest figures, we're close to 40, or I think 42% of people categorized as obese currently in the United States. So what is processing, if you apply it to plant-based foods? It's actually a lot. So we can't go into all the details there, but just for sake of this conversation, we've structured them in these 6 categories. Let's say things from very basic washing and sanitizing, cutting, which you typically apply on fresh fruits and vegetables. So these are all processed, but of course, to a lesser degree than many other foods. Then if we think about cereals, the way we actually consume cereals, we have to trash them, dehusk them, we mill them, we sieve them. Sometimes we actually even bleach them, even though that's a little bit on the way backward. So there's a lot of more intensive process happening. And over this category, we go even up to very, I would say, more transformative techniques, more intensive techniques, things like extractions, concentrations, fractionations, going to processes involving temperature like baking, frying, and extrusion. And they all apply to these broader categories of plant-based foods. And here I'd like to hand it over to my co-presenter, Al. Al?
Happy to do so. So, most people don't realize that, we know that plants are healthy for you, but when you process them, some changes occur, sometimes beneficial, sometimes not as beneficial. So here's one example: when you take soybeans and you process them to produce tofu. Now, they're both soybean-based products, right? But they're not necessarily identical in terms of their qualities. In some ways, soybeans are better. In some ways, tofu might be better. So we just have a summary of how you make tofu. If you're interested, you can look online. There's plenty of descriptions exactly how tofu is made. But importantly, if you take a look at how the macronutrient profiles change, soybeans are 25, 35, and 40 in terms of their lipid to carbohydrate and protein ratios. But tofu is 35, 10, and 55. So you can see that the protein content has gone up when you make tofu. Soybeans are higher in iron, fiber, vitamin B2, 6, potassium, phosphorus, a number of nutrients, but tofu is higher in calcium, magnesium, and selenium. So when you process a food, like I say, you get some beneficial processes and some negative things associated with processing of fruits and vegetables in terms, or plant-based foods. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, what we talk about is what's the impact of processing on nutrients? Well, you can eliminate nutrients, and we'll be talking about that in terms of refining of flours, peeling of fruits and vegetables. You can get a degradation of the nutrients that occur. You can, where vitamins, carotenoids, anthocyanin, you get lost during storage and cooking. One thing people think about vitamin C from their orange juice, you get a lot when you drink your orange juice, but what happens though is during the pasteurization, you get a fairly dramatic drop in the amount of vitamin C that's there. So ascorbic acid is heat sensitive. Differences for refrigeration and frozen storage and canning. The bioavailability of nutrients in terms of your processing, so lycopene in tomato versus tomato paste, and we'll talk about some of these things. Nixtamalization, I'll give you more details on. It's an old process, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the lipid bioavailability by the grinding of peanuts, which I'll talk about. Next slide, please. So if you think about wheat flour, if you think about whole wheat, the whole grain, it's made of bran, endosperm, and germ. And if you were to eat the whole wheat exactly like that, you get the laxation qualities of the bran, you get the caloric content of the endosperm, and some of the nutrients associated with the germ. But if you want to add some shelf life to it and consumer liking, and at one time, of course, white flour was seen as being something the rich ate, and brown flour was in poor societies. We switched that around in many ways. We say educated people should eat whole grains, right? The consumer liking changes and the nutrition liking changes, nutrition value changes with this. So the processing, you can eliminate a lot of nutrients, but you can make them more shelf stable or change the way they're processed, change their qualities. Next slide, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as well. If you look at fresh versus canned, there's some pretty dramatic effects of canning, which of course, it's a very high heat process, right? And in broccoli, for example, you lose 84% of the benefit that you get in terms of ascorbic acid. And with corn, you lose every one of these in terms of the canned process, you're going to lose. And also, of course, you lose quality. Most people who are not familiar with fresh fruits and vegetables or fresh vegetables are surprised by how much crisp there is in it. And we have a faculty member who did her PhD thesis, Zeta Vickers, on crispness. Crispness is a very important quality. We all know that from potato chips. The crisper they are, the better we like them. We don't like mushy potato chips. Well, these, once you can these things, they become mushy, so to speak. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. So nixtamalization is an old process. We all know it from the Mexican food processing. Many years, people who ate corn-based diets wound up with a disease known as pellagra, which occurs due to a deficiency in niacin. And why is that? Well, if you don't process the corn properly, you don't get the availability, the niacin, from the tryptophan, which is synthesized from it. So you cook corn kernels in lye when you're making hominy or other processes. You soften the outside, the hulls, which benefits you because now you have availability in niacin. You don't get pellagra. It improves the amino acid balance because of your tryptophan lysine ratios. And also it increases the mineral content. And importantly, it reduces mycotoxins. So there's, fungal toxins that are in vegetables are very important. And this is one of the processes that helps. Next slide, please. So now when you look at mineral bioaccessibility and bioavailability, the accessibility is, can you get it? Can you absorb it? The bioavailability is, do you actually absorb it? So mineral anti-nutrients are present in many plants. There are things like phytic acid, oxalic acid, things that bind micronutrients. There's also polyphenols and dietary fiber. And the cell wall makes at times where you can't get to all the nutrients that are available. Soluble fibers like pectin bind minerals. Insoluble fibers have a negligible effect compared to it. So the physical barriers I mentioned, the cell wall of the plant, processing techniques can change that. The milling, the soaking, the dehulling, the fermentation, germination, and thermal processing. Along the way, you get some loss of nutrients, but you get some benefits due to removal of some of the fractions in anti-nutrients. Next slide, please. So I asked the question, this is ancient history. When I was just a postdoctoral fellow, I was doing research and I was interested in a guy named Fletcher. Fletcher is the fellow who said you should chew your food once per tooth, 32 times. So he had the phrase, nature will castigate those who don't masticate. You have to be careful when you say that. So the vegetarian diet we looked at, we gave people peanuts, peanut butter, or peanut oil, 80 grams of fat, 76 grams came from that. And we gave them two diets. One was with 20 grams of crude fiber, one was with fiber, back in the days where we used the term crude fiber. The diet was fed for 6 days. And then the joy was to collect feces in paint cans. My great experience with that was walking down the hall of the VA with paint cans in my hands, going to the paint shop. Thankfully, they didn't know what was in that paint can when I went to the paint shop to mix it up to make a homogeneous. Anyway, going to the next slide. So we can show you the results of this. When they were on a high fiber diet, and if you look on the right side, the table shows it as well, but on the right side, you can see you lost a great deal of the peanuts in your feces because you don't chew them thoroughly enough. If you grind them up in a grinder, we just took peanuts and we ground them up to make peanut butter, you didn't lose nearly as much of the dietary fat. You didn't excrete as much. And with peanut oil, you absorbed most of it. And if you were on a low fiber diet, you even absorbed, a greater amount than on the high fiber diet of the peanut oil. And what this really showed, in fact, there was a patient who wanted to look like she had steatorrhea. Steatorrhea is having fat in your feces. And she wanted her GI doctor to feel sorry for her. So this patient is in the literature. She ate a lot of nuts in order to excrete. But the point of this slide is just to show you that just physical changes in food can change your absorption. The next slide shows the same kind of thing with flour. And this is where the physical process, people don't even think about this. So what this is this hydrogen breath study. When you eat a food, if it gets into your colon, the bacteria in the colon make hydrogen, which then gets absorbed into the bloodstream and you excrete it through your mouth. And we would take breath samples of people and see how much hydrogen they excreted. So you can see this over a period of 10 hours. In fasting, of course, your hydrogen goes to nothing over time. With sucrose, you absorb it, unless you are missing sucrase in your GI tract, you absorb it holistically. With white flour, bread made with white flour, you peak at about 7 hours of your hydrogen production. And with macaroni as well. So you're not absorbing all of your flour, all the nutrients from that. It's going into the colon and being absorbed. But we then took low gluten flour. And as you can see, with low gluten flour, no hydrogen was made. It was fully absorbed. Now, if you think about what you were eating when you ate that white wheat bread that we have labeled in bar C, where you got a lot of excretion, bar F is the same exact nutrient content, but it was taken apart. We took the flour, added back the gluten into that flour, and what happened? Interestingly, they absorbed it entirely, whereas as you can see in letter C, they did not absorb it. And anytime you want to give a baseline of no malabsorption, give somebody rice. It's extremely well absorbed. So that gives you an idea of just changing the physical properties of a food can change the absorption of that nutrient. So you have to think about that when you're processing foods. If you give somebody a gluten bread and you took out the gluten and put it back in, it's a very different absorption than if you gave it to them in the natural state. Next slide, please. And we also did a study, these are all ancient history, but I think of interest, to show that the fiber content of a breakfast meal can impact how much you eat at lunch in terms of satiation. And that's due probably to the hydrogen secretion and the satiety associated with a high fiber diet. So we fed people Post Toasties, which is of course very low in fiber, shredded wheat, bran checks, all bran and fiber 1. And you can see in this correlation graph that there was a correlation between the fiber content of the breakfast cereals and the energy intake that occurred at lunch. If they ate a high fiber cereal, they ate less at lunch. And of course, if you eat whole plants, you're getting more fiber. Now, this was insoluble fiber for the most part in that fiber 1, because we're dealing with wheat bran rather than soluble like pectins in fruits and vegetables. But it does demonstrate that the availability of these nutrients changes your satiation, what you're going to eat at your next meal. Now, this was a short-term study. Who knows long-term if it would have made a major difference? But in a short-term study, it did. Next slide, please. Now, iron and zinc bioaccessibility and bioavailability can be affected by anti-nutrients and physical barriers. You can have insoluble or non-absorbable mineral chelates, like with phytic acid and polyphenols. Importantly, zinc binds better to iron than to phytic acid. And those of you who know about flatbread effects in growth of children, in the Middle East, where they fed a lot of flatbread, there was a zinc deficiency, and growth in children was affected by that. Well, what happened there was the yeast, if you don't ferment it, if you don't put yeast in, the yeast have phytase, and they break down the phytic acid, and then the zinc is absorbed very well. But if you go ahead and give people flatbread where they have no yeast involved, that's what happens. And phytase has a positive effect on that. Of course, phytase is inactivated with thermal processing, so when you bake the bread, the phytase is gone. But in the time you're fermenting or the time the bread is rising, it's breaking down and allowing the zinc to be absorbed. And then, of course, there's a complex system of proteins, cell walls, anti-nutrients, and enzymes. While we're focusing on plants, I'll just mention I had done a study many years ago with eggs, and eggs will bind, there's egg protein more in the white than in the yolk, but two different binding proteins that will bind vitamin B12. So even in the binding qualities of some of these foods before they're cooked and absorbed can bind some of these nutrients. The next slide, please. All right, next.
I think this
Yo,
probably
it's your
goes to
turn.
me. Yeah. So want to go to the next topic is actually that ultra processed foods. There's a lot of action in the field, a lot of product launches in the area of these what we call the plant-based foods, which are very often high protein plant-based foods. Think about the category of meat analogs, and they're currently available on all these type of things which resemble meat but are fully plant-based. Think also, it's maybe even more successful, all these dairy analogs, these products which imitate what's in the dairy part of the supermarket with oat milk, soy milk, pea protein-based milk, etc., etc. Also here we should realize that around the world we tend to eat protein in quantities which are beyond, and sometimes, especially for the US and part of Europe, the richer parts of the world, we tend to consume proteins way beyond the recommended values. We focus, and I saw again yesterday, product launches, I think one portion of breakfast cereals, 22 grams of protein, and then you just had your breakfast. So we tend to focus a lot on proteins these days, but also there's a balance needed between protein, carbohydrates, and the lipids. So we tend to overdo it, especially in the United States. We have a very, very significant protein intake, largely meat-based, but also there's we still obtain a significant amount of proteins from plants. In other parts of the world, like in India, most of Asia, most of Africa, actually a lot of the proteins come actually from plant-based foods, plant-based nutrition. So it's just a thing. Also, we'll be focusing here on this development of these categories, and we'll have an example mainly on the meat analogs. Coupling back to Dr. Shah's introduction is we eat meat. Plant-based is more sustainable. It's also in very many cases way more healthy. So if we introduce all these new categories of food, are they going to replace animal-based nutrition, or are they going just to further extend our protein consumption, which also comes with adverse effects? As a consequence of the metabolism of excess proteins, we can, for instance, form kidney stones, which is not a desirable thing to have. But let's have a look at that plant protein-based nutrition. What we typically use there, and that's very different from the traditional plant protein-based nutrition. We actually don't use the whole ingredient. We don't use, let's say, a soy flour or a pea flour. We use concentrates and isolates. So they go through a complex process. I've just outlined the two principles once here to actually increase the protein content for somewhere between, I would say, 10 to 15, sometimes 18 to 20%, to bring that up to 80% or higher, to be able to actually formulate these new categories of foods. So their processing is really, really, really critical. And just one thing to highlight here in that process, I mentioned here isoelectric precipitation, also ultrafiltration. The protein content and even the quality of the protein can be very similar at the end of that process. But they can still be very different in the overall composition and then also the impact on our health. Just think about that. The traditional ways to prepare these isolates is actually first by dissolving it in an alkaline solution, so a base. And then in the process, you precipitate by adding an acid. Now, if you remember your general chemistry, you'll know if you have an acid and a base, that at some moment, there's a lot of actually what you typically use is sodium hydroxide, and then you actually put an acid. So you end up with a lot of sodium in your products. So protein-wise, these two different isolates can be very similar. But what we typically do, and we see that in commercial protein isolates, is actually adding a lot of sodium to our diet, which is also undesirable. So I think also want to highlight here, I think the type of process you're selecting has a fundamental impact not only on the macronutrients, but also the micronutrients, and it might actually have some adverse consequences long-term for our health. So then there's a lot of focus on these, what they call protein quality. So that are the amino acid composition. Typically, I've highlighted here in yellow the essential amino acids, which you can't get from our diet. We see that, depending on these plant-based sources, and I've added egg white as a comparison, that they can actually be sometimes on the low side of these essential amino acids. And that gives rise to lower quality scores for these plant-based protein sources. The typical way this is the reported is the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, the PDCAS. And that's seen as some kind of the holy grail at the moment in actually formulating plant-based foods. One thing as well, our professors of nutrition will always bring up, you're not going to take your protein from one source. So even if you have an ingredient with a low presence of, and maybe even bioavailability of a specific amino acid, you're also going to, in a diverse diet, going to have a range of foods available, and typically they compensate. So also I think here that focus on PDCAS as one of the key markers for protein quality, it's relevant, but it's not the whole story. So then we have these isolates prepared for whatever route, and we've seen that can have an impact specifically on some of these health, micronutrients with health consequences. Then we converted by processing, and this is one of these techniques which is mentioned as ultra-processed by Montero et al. We converted by extrusion into these plant-based meat alternatives or meat analogs. Very classical, it's already around for probably close to half a century. What we call TVPs, texturized vegetable proteins, which are usually transported in salt and dry state, prehydrated. They're a bit of a spongy type of texture. And these days we have also what we call the high moisture extrudates, the high moisture meat analogs, which actually display that fibrous texture where very many say this resembles meat. Now we have these extrudates, but it doesn't mean that we have a product. And I want to actually use this to actually to make the transition also to what Al and me have been proposing. Is on one hand we have the process, and it's really critical also the type of ingredients we use, and there can be all kinds of effects, either beneficial or detrimental of the processing on both composition, on the bioavailability or bioaccessibility of ingredients. But if we go to that ultra processing, where it very often turns around is we have a base product, but we have to formulate that into an appealing product. So these categories, these novel categories of foods, let it be these, and we're focusing here on these high protein, plant protein foods like meat analogs, like these dairy analogs, they are formulated. We have a number of ingredients, in the premix that is extruded. We add way more ingredients when we actually formulate the actual products. It's not that it's an intensive product. No, we add a lot of additives to actually make it into a food that people want to buy, that people want to eat. Just looking at these some of these nutrition facts panel, I always tell people look at the backside of a food packaging, not on the front. We see that these are both meat analogs, that they contain a whole range of additives. So this brought us, and actually, Al and I had extensive conversations starting about what I mentioned about that year and a half ago about distinguishing the processing from the formulation. So realizing that processing, and we gave examples both from the processing side and the health side on how processing impacts the healthfulness of ingredients and of foods. But also a very important one, and access that we really want to distinguish is formulation. It's actually the act of putting ingredients together to formulate a food, which is not basically a processing step. That's product development that's driven very often by marketing considerations, by consumer appeal, etc. So that's really the formulation which matters. And Bilal, I'm sorry about the colors, and next time we'll update it with a different forms. But in red are here the things which are actually formulated not to be good for you. What we see, we can also formulate foods that actually are healthy for you. So here, the thing what we want to emphasize are choices that food developers can make that render processed foods or ultra-processed foods more healthy or less healthy. Al, back to you.
Okay. Well, you've just been hearing about how you make these foods. So if you think about it, in this slide, we're talking about soy-based burgers. And on the right side, you see the beef, 80% lean, and you see the nutrient content. So while they can, in many ways, they can match at some level, like protein content or caloric content. I mean, there's differences across it. You have to realize, for example, that the beef, if you look at the sodium content, and this is what we were talking about making these things and increasing the salt, 66 milligrams of sodium, which is nothing to really worry about. But then you look at some categories, that Morningstar vegan soy-based burger has 580 milligrams of salt in it, sodium, not of salt, of sodium. And so if you eat that, plus you eat it on a piece of bread or some kind of a bun that has another couple hundred milligrams of sodium, you're getting a lot of sodium before you even eat your French fries that are salted. So if you look at the categories, we can simulate a lot of things. The fiber is going to be a little bit higher, obviously, in plant-based foods than in an animal-based food. But if you look across all of these categories, the saturated fat is going to be different. You can make things better in certain categories and come to some benefit from it. But at the same time, there could be a problem. However, we haven't talked about this at all, but Dave Tillman and others have done a lot of work on the environmental impact. And the environmental impact is fairly great for beef versus these other products, even though there is, the processing itself has some use of energy, obviously. Next slide, please. The next slide is really a complex slide. It's hard to see all the different things here, and they're in colors to top it off. But the point of this is that what we're looking at here is the nutrient profiling of alternative meat sources versus various meat sources of different sorts. So the purple, we're looking at a meat category. In yellow, we're looking at non-vegan substitutes. In red, poultry meat. In green, red meat. But as it says on the bottom, if it's properly formulated, the nutrient profile of meat analogs can be similar or can even be improved compared to processed meats. And clearly, when you eat something like sausages, you're going to have a very high sodium content, whether it's beef or whether it's a substitute. But this is a study, the reference is on here, and it's too hard a slide to really go through point by point. And we don't have the time anyway. We want to get to some questions. So let's go to the next slide. This just shows you that you can do either one. And on this one, you're looking at cow's milk versus silk versus another type of soy milk. And once again, you can look at the serving sizes and see the energy. The energy is less if you have organic, unsweetened soy milk. A lot of people like it sweetened, but the protein content can be very similar. You can make these things very, very similar in a lot of ways. And this is just a comparison chart for people who are interested in using soy-based milk versus cow's milk. And a lot of people worry about cow's milk because of the lactose content. But now we have processing, and Job has already spoken about filtering methods. There are some milks that increase the protein to the level we don't need as much protein, but they increase the protein and take out the lactose. There are other lactase-based milks that make the milk sweeter, because when you break down lactase, you have two sugars that you're breaking down from lactose, and they sweeten the milk. The next slide, please. So when we formulate plant-based foods, on the next slide, you'll start seeing that sometimes we fortify or we enrich Enrichment is the process where you just add more of the things that are naturally there. Fortification is a practice of increasing one or more micronutrients in a food condiment to improve the nutritional quality. So, for example, if you want to avoid thyroid disease and you want to have enough iodine in your diet, we add sodium iodide to table salt. If you look at breakfast cereals, if you don't want to get a lot of iron, don't eat breakfast cereals. A lot of breakfast cereals have a ton of iron in them because they're trying to give you all of your iron in one breakfast meal. But you do get iron in other sources during the day. They have vitamins and minerals in breakfast cereals. And then, of course, we add folic acid to wheat flour to make it a better product in terms of health and nutrition. And of course, in children's formulations, we do a lot of that. So that's the fortification rather than the enrichment. The next slide, please. Then we get into the whole processing side. So what Yo showed you in this, when you're going to turn plants into animal-based foods, you've got to add a lot of additives. And when people are talking about ultra-processed foods, I will show you a slide just to give you an idea. The medical community just doesn't like the idea of additives, and it's been talked about forever. So, food additives, emulsifiers, there's a lot of literature on emulsifiers people seem to be worried about. Thickeners, gelling agents, flavors, colorants. Boy, we used to have maraschino cherries was the only product that allowed that red dye in it. Nowhere else would they allow it because it was carcinogenic. Humectants to dry out the food, high intensity sweeteners, and micronutrients. Next slide, please. So these food additives some of the indirect ones, a lot of the ones that come from, like as it shows on here, food associated with pesticides, food packaging, metals, bisphenol A, phytoestrogens that are found in plant-based foods and dietary supplements. They can have what's called endocrine disruption, where they're changing and they interfere with the function of the endocrine system. And if you talk to nutritionists who come out of the agricultural field, like many of us do, we're seen by the medical community as pro-industry, and we don't worry about all these additives in the industry. Endocrinologists that I've spoken to have talked about this endocrine disruptors much more than the nutritionists that I've heard talk about this. And the products can also have effects on our gut microbiota, which now that whole area of the microbiome has tremendous discussion, even about the fact that it could change your behavior, how you feel, because the bacteria make products that are then absorbed and eventually can get to the brain supposedly, or have brain effects. Next slide, please. So emulsifiers, which are really something that maintains a uniform emulsion of 2 or more phases of food, are used widely in foods. They are highly regulated though, and they've been shown to have limited toxicity, but there are preliminary data that suggest those with bowel disease, inflammatory bowel disease, and some metabolic syndrome effects. There's preliminary data that suggests it's mostly from animal studies. We need more studies in humans. Some modify the luminal and mucosal microbiome. So there could be some problems with that. Next slide. And then this is the one I wanted to emphasize, because the American Academy of Pediatrics had this paper. It's on the bottom, you can see the reference to it, which was really bad-mouthing a lot of food additives and indirect food additives like bisphenols and phthalates and PFC, perchlorates. And then forever, those of you who have been around for a while and know this literature, there was the Feingold diet. Everybody was worried about dyes and foods, and it was going to make your kids hyperactive, and sugar was going to make your kids hyperactive. Maybe the reason sugar made your kids hyperactive is they got it at parties. They didn't get it necessarily all the other times. Old data, most of it showed that it wasn't involved in attention deficit or hyperactivity, but it's still being discussed and looked at to this day. I remember tartrazine, yellow dye. That was one that was said, don't eat that, it makes your kid hyperactive. And then, of course, nitrates and nitrites we've been discussing as carcinogens forever in processed meats, fish, and chicken, and probably in processed plant-based meats as well. The next slide, please. So claims about food additives in the gut have also been discussed, and there's a number of papers in this area that show an increased incidence of GI diseases and gut homeostasis due to what they think are the food additives. But most of this is from animal studies that have a negative effect on the GI tract. We need to do more studies even silver nanoparticles, which could be used in processing, can damage the intestinal microvilli. So the food additive things, Job and I have talked about this. There's not a lot of solid data on this, but there's a lot of inflammatory data where people will talk about this, and the medical field discusses this pretty often as a bad thing. And the ultra processing, of course, all these additives. Next slide, and I think we're getting near the end here.
Yeah, I think we're done, Al.
So at this point, thank you very much. We included some backup slides just in case somebody asked a question that we had a slide for. So we're happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much for that great discussion and educational information talk, Dr. Ubbink and Dr. Levine. And now I'll open the floor for some questions. Also please feel free to pop your questions into the chat box. I saw Dr. Shah, so Bipin Shah, you had your hand up during the, so I'll let you take the first question. You're muted, you're on mute.
Yeah, my question is regarding excess protein, with the protein slide that was shown for different countries. Is there a negative impact of excess protein?
Yes, I think what I know, for instance, I mentioned, kidney stones. There's a lot of work for the kidney to excrete this excess urea, for instance, which is one of the metabolites. I assume as well, other effects. Al, do you have other examples?
Well, I think mostly it's been the load on the kidney that people have discussed associated with that. And also, we're not sure that, there's a lot of argument about what the recommended dietary allowance for the daily amount of protein. But we used to say 0.8 grams per kilogram. So you'd figure around 56 grams of protein. And, a couple cans of tuna will take care of that without a problem. So we can overconsume. People are too worried about protein, but some people in terms of muscle building and other things in aging think you should have more protein. So it's not straightforward.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Olive, do you want?
Yes. No, thank you so much. And Alan and Job, Dr. Ubbink or Dr. Levine comment to talk about. And so some of the topic you touch on, and it's so familiar. From my experience, and so with over 25 years, and so especially with double fortified salt or multiple fortified salt, use a salt as a simple vehicle and to enrich or fortify iron, iodine, folic acid, vitamin B12. From my personal experience, and even before COVID, and also visit India, working with some kind of commercial partners, and so we scale it up, and so for commercial, multiple or double fortified salt, and now and so reach into over 150 million people, I would say, real people, to help them address the especially iron deficient anemia. I just feel proud about that. But constantly when I came back, and so even students from nutrition food science, they ask me, and then they challenge me, say, okay, is that ultra processed food? I have to really admit, say, yes, it is ultra processed food, because multiple steps, and so encapsulation, extrusion-based delivery system, blah, blah, blah. But my argument is here, and so I want to be careful, because the other side, and so we have a nutrition faculty, our colleagues, from their perspective, and I also see the concern why this ultra processing and carries a little kind of some, negative notation. But I can really defend for mine, because salt, when we double, triple, multiple fortify, we carry and deliver some nutrients, is small enough. We used to joke about, and so salt is the uniform, very universal, and so no matter the social economic status, and no matter how much you reach, and so you're a billionaire, you won't eat more than 10 grams per day. Even you are so poor, you still need to have at least 5 or 6 grams per day. So that's what I think. And so sometimes it's really hard. It's hard to draw conclusions, say the ultra processed food is bad or wrong, or plant-based is bad or good or bad. But I think more important, my argument, the point is we need to talk And it's even more important between food scientists, food technologists, and with nutrition dietitians. So we need to talk constantly, and so we serve to the same purpose. So oftentimes the food scientist formulation or engineer for processing development, we kind of under the guidance of our nutrition faculty or colleagues. So they discover something. So we kind of follow their discovery. They're more from science, right? And so the human demands, then we follow them and then come up with our processing and formulation. And let's probably don't like point a finger and blame each other. We should work together as a team. So that's my point. Thank you.
Yeah, I could maybe just give a very, very brief feedback. I realize I think we're also at time, but we still have time for further questions. It was one of the reasons that Al and me wanted to introduce the distinction. We really have to look at the individual steps in the process. Like with the plant proteins, there are ways to produce them low sodium. There are ways to produce them high sodium. That is a consensus choice that in this case, food engineers or food processors can make. Also on the formulation, and that's the reason why it's important to distinguish it, there are consensus choices that are made to put something in a food. And if we put it all in one broader category of ultra-processed foods, where admittedly many of the foods are not good for you, they're maybe for an occasional indulgence or as a comfort food, but not really in a bulk measure. But there are choices that are made, and that can also be made differently, and they can result in foods that fit in a more wholesome diet.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment. I'll make a quick comment on that. Ultra-processed categories is a tremendous oversimplification. You know, it's just easy to talk about, and you just talk about ultra-processed, but there's good and there's bad in ultra-processed, and it's an oversimplification that the medical community has tacked on to. And, you know, of course, we know one of the main reasons is the food industry has made this food so tasty that it's so-called addictive. Mm-hmm. And then we have the obesity epidemic. So that's the drama associated with it.
Yeah, thank you for those pointers. And the questions that I have on the chat box are like touching on those concepts. I'll read those and perhaps you can add some more insights into those. So can you please discuss more about the difference between formulation versus processing and its effects on nutrients and health outcomes? So I think we already started discussing that here. Would you like to add anything to that question, for that question?
Go ahead, Job.
Yeah, that processing is everything which having to do with the transformation, and that goes really to food processors or the food engineers who can design a process to make it more wholesome, and it's typically at the ingredient level to make it more wholesome. You know, there's no need to completely refine a flour. You can leave a little bit of the germ there, or a little bit of the bran, or maybe all of the bran. Also, what I highlighted, I briefly just mentioned that how you produce a protein isolate. That formulation is really that goes really to the product developers, to those in food companies. And Al mentioned food which is really ultra palatable, which is so attractive and on purpose formulated to be so attractive. That's the reason we're to identify the formulation as distinct from the processing. The processing, we need all the foods. I think we demonstrated it here, at least we argue that all the foods are processed. And there are choices made in formulating, and those need to be identified. And those, you know, there you can make other choices.
But, you know, I'd also emphasize, if you look at fruits and vegetables, one of the problems is the consistency of quality. So you go out and you buy a cantaloupe, you cut it open, and it's terrible. It's like junk. Or you buy some tomatoes and you try to eat them, and they're just all mush and they don't have any flavor to them. If you take a Triscuit out of a box, you get the same Triscuit every time you take it. So the thing about processing is you guarantee the quality of the food and the consistency. And with fruits and vegetables, even though we're very much pro in that area, depending on who manufactured them, you know, tomatoes used to be, when I grew up, were really good. But as soon as we went to mechanical harvesting, they made the outside hard so that the mechanical harvesting could be done. And, you know, at Minnesota, we have one of the world's great fruit geneticists, Jim Luby. And that's where, for example, the Honeycrisp apple came from, and many other apples. He's improved the quality of those apples so that people will eat apples instead of the red delicious that used to come in a boxed lunch and has no flavor.
Mm-hmm. Great points. All right. Dr. Hassan, do you have any question? I would like to ask some questions.
It's just one of my students. She's shy to ask the question, but because now the younger generation, they are really concerned about, health and performance. And a lot of them, they in weightlifting and bodybuildings. And their question, I get it a lot. And one of them now is here and listening. If I consume plant proteins and I don't consume,
Animal.
cheese or yogurt or meat or chicken, can I still grow the same muscle mass? I mean, they don't know much about the science, but they want to know as a consumer, would that be feasible to build the same muscle mass or not?
So that's been discussed in the nutrition community forever. And so if you had a limited diet, you would do better with animal protein than with plant protein, because you'd have limited availability of amino acids unless you mix them properly. There's that famous book by LePay, Diet for a Small Planet. And everybody discussed the way you mixed your plant stuff. But if you eat enough plant matter and enough plant protein, that issue is less of an issue. If you're a complete vegan, you may have some problems particularly with vitamin B12, for example, and everyone knows that. But I think you can do fine on plant protein. It's just easier with animal protein to get a complete protein. It's just simpler.
Okay. We started talking about the obesity epidemic and food processing being related to that. The chat, I have a question. So many individuals blame the obesity epidemic on food processing. Is there a source where more research can be found in this area?
I think it's very difficult to know. It is categorized in ultra processing, and I think there's a lot of would say at least anecdotal evidence that is, there is that correlation. On the other hand, we try to argue there's actually not a processing. It's more how these foods are made available to people. It is, they're 24/7 in convenience stores. These palatable type of foods which are available. So it's not so much the processing. It's just that the whole context. We live in a society with an ultra high accessibility of foods which are not properly formulated for us, and there's the foods that we crave, and that's the food that we can't stop eating.
Yeah, my entire career is devoted to that. I'm a neuroscientist. So we have shown that the brain will think, if it can't get all the palatable food it wants, it thinks it's energy deprived. We've demonstrated that in animal models anyway. So yes, there's a huge literature. That's a question that has an enormous literature associated with it. Places like the Manel Institute and many of my colleagues have done a lot of studies on preference, and the neurotransmitters are involved in the whole area of food addiction. You can see the release that makes it look like cocaine in terms of the release of certain neurotransmitters.
Oh, that's great. That's interesting. Very strong. So another question here, are plant-based multivitamin supplements fully digestible?
Plant-based, you mean
Multivitamin.
vitamins that are derived from plants?
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, I guess it depends on whether the anti-nutrients are present in the processing that don't allow the absorption of them, but they should be fine. I mean, whatever vitamin you look at chemically is the same in a plant as it is in an animal-based food. B12 is the one thing that we talk about because you don't find it in plants unless you're eating the dirt along with it from the dirt microbes.
All right. I have a question. So we were discussing about additives. So what is the industry stance on, choosing between processing and formulation and the use of additives? So where do they stand? And, because that would have some implications on health.
That's your area.
I think there are two sides to it. The first of all, we see a lot of what we call clean label processing and clean label foods. So there's a very significant drive, mainly because of desire to maintain market share or to increase market share, so that to formulate foods clean label, so without these explicit additives. On the other hand, there's maybe some cases, significant questioning going on from how valid are some opinions which are around, where people, in food formulation, they still want to continue to use additives. I think this is still a field in flux, and what Al mentioned is really, really need for additional human trials to really, work out all these various impacts, which you now start to know on the gut microbiome, et cetera, that needs to be nailed down. So the industry responds as to where it stands, but I see a lot of emphasis on clean label processing, clean label formulation of foods.
So in that line, Dr. Ubbink, we have like databases for nutrients and things like that, but we do not have databases for additives and the concentration of it. Like we can see on the ingredient label, something like, what are the additives, but we don't know how much. So if for research interest, if anybody wants to look at a certain additive and based on the dietary recalls that we do, what would be, an approach for us to know how much additive is there in each food? And so we can do some kind of, additive composition analysis in people.
Yeah, I must say, of course, legal limits on what you can use for most of these, if not almost all of these additives. A reason that they're not on the label, that typically they with current knowledge, they're of course really safe for us. The other thing is that if you would have that complete formulation, including percentages, basically, a food for formulation. So companies would give up a competitive advantage because you'll tell them basically this is what I produce. So for that reason, I think it is also not put on the label.
Yeah, so it's very proprietary, and but that would be great research to know like how much of this additive are people eating from different processed foods to actually know, and then study the impact of the various concentrations. So yeah. All right, I'll, any other questions from the floor, from the people here? If not, I would like to thank Dr. Ubbink and Dr. Levine for the informational and educational talk. We really enjoyed it, and thank you so much for your time.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.